All right, there has been concern for decades that some African nations are too reliant on foreign aid, but now African governments and companies are collaborating to alleviate extreme poverty. The African Prosperity Fund was announced a few days ago at the Global Citizen Festival in Accra, Ghana, by President Nana Akufo-Addo. To discuss, we're joined by Yavi Madurai, a Digital Transformation Strategist. That's why we often speak to you.
Yes.
But you are integrally involved in this venture as one of the founders, one of the CEOs. What brought it about? It sounds like it's all about Africans doing it for Africans.
Exactly that. You know, one of the key things about Africa, there was a term in the 1970s, I think it was, where futurists at the time and economic analysts spoke about Africa rising, which meant that it would be the last frontier for economic growth and prosperity and all of those kind of things. We never got there.
We're still waiting.
Clearly, we never got there. With COVID, a lot of what we saw was aid. And we've got, you know, all these kind of plans. If you look at just South Africa, for example, we've got the NDP 2030, which is kind of 7.5 years away. We've got Agenda 2063 from an African Union perspective. So we've got all these beautiful plans and strategies.
Sustainable development goals globally.
The SDGs. Yeah. So we've got all of these things, and there's a lot of work happening across the continent. But there's also a lot of aid that is happening, you know, on the continent. There's a lot of aid coming in from outside. And how that is going to play out over the next couple of years becomes a concern, or becomes a point of concern in terms of those of us around that are thinking, well, how do we create something that is for us, but also by us, so that we focus on the things that is important to us, and not necessarily purely because it's given by aid, if I can put it that way.
So are you saying the aid should not come from foreign countries? The aid should come from African governments and African companies?
Yes, effectively. We should be getting to a point where we have the kind of resources, because we have resources on the continent, and I'm not just talking about South Africa, we have resources on the continent where we have listed companies, we've got major multinationals, we have got billionaires across the continent. Yes, not as many as some other countries and continents, but we do have. So the time has come for us to look at it from that perspective and go, well, how do we start creating a collective environment and a collective target for ourselves in order to be able to drive some of the things that need to be done? When we look at things like infrastructure development, when we look at healthcare, and in terms of the vaccine when COVID happened, look at all of those kind of things. These are real issues that, you know, all governments can't always fund everything themselves. Corruption aside, we've got to get to a point where we start looking at things, but then it's also important to remember that we've got to have an outcomes-based approach. So as much as that there are projects, you know, across the continent, we need to have a deadline. We need to have outcomes. We need to have specifics that we can measure, monitor, and evaluate, if I can put it that way.
And let's be clear, some of the foreign aid has in fact dried up. But is the money there? You know, African governments are always saying they don't have the money. South Africa has bemoaned the fact that sometimes it's been funding, say, some of the peace operations. There are rumors around that. So is the money there? You also talk about the private sector. Is that the real honeypot, I guess?
Yes and no, because I think it's a combination of things, and I think it's also about how we approach it. So when you look at the kind of crises that we are dealing with, and whether it's South Africa, whether it's other countries across the continent, we are dealing with fairly much the same kind of issues. It's infrastructure, either lack of or development lack of. We are looking at things like access to technology. We are looking at things like access to healthcare. So when you look at, and I'm just giving you a few examples, you know, education, the list goes on. When you look at some of those kind of things, and we look at the money actually being poured into it, because let's be clear, there is money being poured into some of these things. But somewhere along the line then also, there's not necessarily and that is why I spoke about the outcomes-based approach, because that is also our key differentiator, is that we want to be able to be held accountable. We want to be able to tick off certain boxes to say, this is project management within an inch of its life.
Yeah.
And this is exactly where we are. If we're going to build a road, that road has to be funded by this entity for that reason, and this is when it will be done, for example. So for us, this becomes very important to be able to merge some of those private sector deliverable approach with from a funding perspective, but bear in mind, this is still an impact fund at the end of the day. So it is very much about impact on Africa more than anything else.
So how do you get people to put money down when it's a new fund, as it were? I see that Aspen has come forward and pledged, but how do you get that ball rolling?
Sure. So it obviously is a a chicken and egg situation, which comes first, which doesn't. But I think it comes down to the fact that there's a couple of things I think that goes into anything like this, and it all comes down to a matter of, first of all, trust. So we need to be able to make sure that things like governance, things like ethics, fiscal policies, regulations, all of those kind of things are in place. So that is what we're busy doing at the moment. We're making sure that every little T is crossed and every I is dotted. You can imagine 55 countries across the continent having different regulatory policies is quite a thing.
This is tough.
So this is what we're doing at the moment. We're trying to make sure that everyone is taken care of under, in terms of compliance. So that's the first thing. So coming back to Aspen, it was about being able to show value of where their projects and what they are able to do and how we align those projects. Their ultimate objective is to ensure that life-saving medicine reaches, Africa's most vulnerable. So it ties in. It was an easy one once we made the proper pitch and we were able to align our objectives.
The final problem, African governments collaborating, remember COVID-19, and there was going to be this clout in terms of negotiating and getting the vaccines onto the continent. I think a lot of people had questions about the impact of that initiative.
Sure, and look,
and that was in the midst of a pandemic.
It was in the midst of a pandemic, and I think a lot of it, obviously I can't answer for the whole vaccine scenario that played out, but when we look at the collaboration aspect, we were divided for so long. We're now, born under a different objective. We have different goals, number one. Number two, COVID did happen, and it did show us that we need to be united in more ways than one. And the last aspect of it is that we are then using our access and our networks from an African perspective and that is why we started the Prosperity Fund, purely because we have access, we have networks across the continent to be able to say, how do we start stepping up as active citizenry and start pulling that together and doing our bit in order to be able to drive that collaboration.
All right, well, hopefully it leads to more prosperity.
From your lips to God's ears.
Indeed. Yavi Madurai, Digital Transformation Strategist, one of the founders, explaining this Prosperity Fund launched just a few days ago.